The strain situation, basically they're measuring infant attachment. Mary Ainsworth, as a psychologist, started doing this. Does the caregiver provide the child with security and confidence is the question that they're asking. And so they take the pair into a room, then they take mom out of the room, and then they see how the kid behaves with that mom, and then they put the two back together. This is where they kind of start to explore attachment styles. So securely attached babies, they'll use the caregiver as a secure base from which to explore the environment. They be maybe a little bit timid at first, but they eventually start to explore the new environment on their own, and when the caregiver returns, they're happy to see them. So this is how Leif is, especially when he was in daycare about, 8 months or 18 months or so. At first, when we first get to daycare, he'd walk into the room, and he was like, he wasn't so sure about it, but then he'd start walking around, and then he'd have fun, and it'd be great. I'd leave him, and then when I'd come back in the afternoon, he was happy to see me, we'd do a big hug, and everything was great. He's definitely securely attached to both me and his mother. Insecure avoidant babies, they avoid the caregiver. When the caregiver does come back, the kid doesn't even care. I have seen this, and it's kind of sad. Anyways, insecure resistant babies, they cling to the caregiver at first, then they resist the caregiver, so they'll fight them against the closeness when they're trying to hold them together, so they're pushing away, they cling to them, push away, cling to them, so they call this insecure resistant babies. And then the last one is insecure disorganized. They just kind of don't appear all there. They appear dazed and confused and maybe even fearful. What the textbook says is that caregivers of the insecurely attached infants, so that's the avoidant, the resistant, and the disorganized, there's something wrong with that relationship. That they tend to be, the caregivers anyways, tend to be rejecting, inconsistent, or maybe even possibly abusive. You want your kid to be securely attached because it's linked to all kinds of positive stuff. Positive emotional health, self-esteem, self-confidence. They're more socially competent. And these things last all the way, probably for the rest of their lives, at least through adolescence, according to the book. But once you start going down a path, if you're all self-confident, more socially competent as an adolescent, you probably are going to be the same way as an adult. The point of this is that this stuff sticks with you. This first attachment with a caregiver can play a very important part in the rest of a person's life in how they are going to be dealing with other people and the kind of attachments that they'll have with others. So it's super important to try to get that secure attachment if you can. That being said, some of these studies haven't replicated, and that's typical in developmental. It's actually typical in all psychologies, but especially with some of these like correlational things with developmental psychology, hasn't quite replicated. One study showed that divorced parents was a better predictor than attachment style. One study showed that SES was a better predictor than childhood attachment on how you are later on in life. And so, yeah, it's probably a combination of all those things. Your attachment, your SES for a lot of people, and divorce is definitely because they're modeling, essentially. If you see that your parents are not getting along and they're divorced, that may be behavior that you model. Anyways, lots of potential variables in there, and that's going to be true for a lot of research in developmental psychology. There's also gene environment interaction that the book talks about here, the 5-HTT-LPR. We discussed it in an earlier chapter. It's the gene that we talked about before with depression. Babies with short versions of this gene developed disorganized attachment, but that was only if they have inconsistent mothers. So they have this gene that predisposes them for this disorganized attachment, but only if there's something in the environment, the inconsistent mother, that kind of gets them to go down that path. Yes, so genes, environment, it's a cycle. Another way to think about this, like with attachment, let's say you have a difficult kid, and so when you have one that's difficult and it's hard to deal with them, it's just hard for you to want to deal with that person, and that's going to go back and forth. You're going to give off that, I'm tired of this, and that person is going to pick up on that. And so what comes first? Is the temperament off, and then the caregiver becomes inconsistent and I don't want to say abusive, inconsistent, whatever the other thing was, but that child is giving something off that the caregiver does not like, and it goes back and forth. The kid picks up that the caregiver doesn't like all their behaviors. So anyways, it can create an attachment issue. But the question is, which comes first? Is the caregiver off, or does the infant have genes that makes them less suited to the environment they're in, mainly their parents? all that being said, just something to keep in mind. This is all correlational. They're not doing experiments where they set up attachment styles for different kids. That would be unethical. Okay, so that's it for attachment style. On the next slides, we'll start talking about managing behavior and a little bit on socialization.